The human heart is a strange, magnificent engine, built for eternity yet trapped in the fleeting moment. It is a vessel designed to hold the infinite, but which constantly tries to fill itself with the finite. We chase satisfaction, we accumulate pleasure, and inevitably we encounter pain. But what if the pain we feel, the quiet ache of loneliness, the sharp grief of loss, the gnawing anxiety about the future is not a mistake in the cosmic design, but a profound signal? What if suffering is the most eloquent voice of the soul crying out for its true home? This is the central inquiry of the Confessions of St. Augustine, a work that transcends mere autobiography. It is an extended prayer, a searching philosophical treatise, and the foundational document of Western psychological thought, all bound together by the relentless pursuit of God. Augustine opens his monumental work with a thesis that defines the human condition across all ages and cultures. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. This restlessness is the engine of our suffering. The core question of this video is not merely why we suffer, but what our pain truly means, according to the man who first mapped the inner landscape of the Christian soul. Augustine shifts the focus entirely. Pain is not primarily a consequence of external bad luck. It is a profound metaphysical and psychological indicator of a soul misaligned. Our pain is the inevitable consequence of a mind stretched and fragmented by the relentless flow of time, and a will misdirected by misplaced affection. It is the sound of our spiritual compass spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Augustine experienced this suffering acutely in the early chapters of his life story. We see the two primary faces of human pain laid bare: the sorrow of external loss and the misery of internal self-division. First, there is the intense, almost unbearable grief over the death of his unnamed friend in Milan. This was a purely human attachment, a soul bound so closely to another that its severing felt like a physical tearing. He describes his state with astonishing rawness, admitting that his tears alone were sweet to him, for in his heart's desire they had taken the place of his friend. He found no solace in life, no comfort in sunshine or company, because everything he saw reminded him of what he had lost. This grief was not just sadness, it was a physical and spiritual torment. He felt himself to be lacerated and bloody, finding no place to rest his soul because he carried the wound of his friend's absence within himself. Yet even in the midst of this profound sorrow, Augustine made a startling realization. His suffering was not caused by the friend's death alone, but by his decision to love a finite mortal being, as if that being were the source of eternal life. He realized that his misery was a result of his love for things that cannot last, things destined to pass away. The pain was the justified consequence of having tethered his immortal soul to a perishable object. Before his eventual conversion, Augustine struggled to make sense of suffering through the lens of Manichaeism. This dualistic philosophy taught that the universe was governed by two co-equal eternal principles: the kingdom of light, good, and the kingdom of darkness, evil. In this view, suffering was simply the result of the intrusion of the dark material substance into the good spiritual substance. This provided a simple but ultimately unsatisfying answer to the problem of evil. Augustine's intellectual necessity was to prove that God is both all good and all-powerful, thereby dismantling the dualistic error. This led him to one of the most significant philosophical breakthroughs in Christian history, his radical rethinking of the nature of evil itself. This intellectual journey provided the necessary foundation for understanding why pain exists in a world created by a benevolent God. The philosophical stage was set for a new kind of theodicy, an explanation of divine justice. We move now to the metaphysics of pain, understanding that suffering must be explained within the context of a wholly good creator. Augustine starts from the scriptural foundation. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. If God's creation is entirely good, then God cannot have created evil. Evil cannot be a substance, a thing, or a positive entity that exists in the same way that light or matter exists. This understanding marked Augustine's intellectual departure from the Manichaean framework. The profound shift in thinking defines evil not as a presence, but as a lack. Evil is the privation of good. It is the absence of a good that ought to be present in a specific creation. To grasp this concept fully, we must use Augustine's own analogies. Consider blindness. Blindness is not a created object or a positive force. It is the absence of sight in an eye that was created to see. The eye is good. The sight is good. The lack of sight is the privation, which we call blindness. Similarly, physical pain is the privation of bodily integrity and well-being. Sickness is the absence of health. Moral evil or sin is the privation of rightly ordered will and justice. It is the turning away from the higher good toward a lower good. This definition carries enormous implications for understanding suffering. If evil is not a substance, it does not require a separate evil creator. It means that all suffering in its essence is a vacuum, a hole where goodness should reside. The cause of moral pain, therefore, lies entirely with the misuse of free will. The source of all evil, both spiritual and moral, is the free choice of created beings, both angels and humans, to turn away from the immutable supreme good toward mutable lesser goods. The fall of humanity, encapsulated in the story of Adam, established original sin not as a stain of substance, but as the inherited state of a corrupted and weakened will. Our pain and suffering entered the world not because of a flaw in God's eternal design, but because of a fundamental flaw in creaturely choice. The creature chose to imitate God's independence rather than reflect God's goodness. This choice broke the internal harmony of the soul, and that broken harmony is felt as pain. Augustine expands this philosophical framework by placing evil within the broader context of the order of creation. The universe, when viewed as a whole, is a harmonious, beautiful system, where even what appears as evil contributes to the overall completeness of the cosmos. This is the aesthetic theme of Augustine's theodicy. Just as a painting uses dark colors to make the light ones stand out, or a symphony uses moments of dissonance to highlight the final harmony, so too does the universe use the reality of suffering to emphasize the overwhelming reality of goodness. This idea is deeply tied to the principle of plenitude, the notion that God's goodness is so expansive that all possible degrees of goodness are realized in creation, including those that are contingent and capable of falling away. The paradox of evil, then, is that God is so good, so infinitely powerful, that he judged it better to bring good out of evil than to suffer no evil to exist. He permits the shadow of pain only because he can perfectly weave it into the tapestry of redemption. This frames pain not as a meaningless horror, but as a necessary shadow that highlights the light of goodness, even though for the individual experiencing it, it is felt as a real and terrible force of destruction and sorrow. The metaphysical explanation of evil as privation satisfies the intellect, but it does not fully account for the internal, subjective experience of suffering. For this, Augustine turns inward, embarking on a profound psychological inquiry, particularly in Book 11 of the Confessions, focusing on the mystery of time. Augustine's famous question, "What then is time?" is not merely an academic exercise. It is the key to understanding human anxiety and the deep-seated misery of the soul. He struggles with the common understanding that time consists of past, present, and future. The past is gone and no longer exists. The future is not yet real. The present, the only moment that seems to exist, is a razor-thin instant that slips into the past the moment we try to grasp it. If time is only measured by things that are constantly moving out of existence, how can we truly measure it? Augustine reaches a revolutionary conclusion. Time exists primarily within the soul, not as an external river. Time is a measure of movement and change, and that measurement occurs in the mind. The past is present in the soul as memory. The future is present in the soul as expectation. The present moment, the fleeting instant, is present in the soul as attention. This internal measurement of time is what Augustine calls the strain of the soul. The soul is stretched and pulled between the memory of what was and the expectation of what is to come. This stretching, this distension, is the precise psychological location of human suffering. Human misery arises directly from the mind being pulled apart by the changes of past and future, unable to maintain a unified focus on the eternal, stable reality of God. We are fractured by temporality. The soul is fragmented. We are perpetually anxious about the future, wondering if our hopes will be fulfilled or our fears realized. We are regretful of the past, dwelling on mistakes and losses that can no longer be changed. This constant oscillation prevents the soul from resting in the stability of the present moment, which is the only doorway to eternity. Pain, therefore, is the felt experience of this fragmentation, the soul's inability to maintain a unified focus on the unchangeable truth. When we are overwhelmed by regret, we are suffering from an unhealthy attachment to memory. When we are paralyzed by anxiety, we are suffering from an unhealthy attachment to expectation. Both pull us away from the reality that is God. The solution to the strain of the soul is found in the nature of God himself. God's existence is not temporal. He precedes all times in the sublimity of an everlasting present. God is the eternal I Am, unchanging and stable. The goal of the spiritual life, therefore, is to move from the temporal strain of the soul to rest in God's eternal stability. When the soul can align its memory, attention, and expectation toward God, the fragmentation begins to heal. Augustine explains that the heart flutters about between the changes of past and future until it finds rest in the unchangeable being of the Creator. The deeper our immersion in the temporal, the deeper our strain, and the more intense our pain. To be fully human is to be temporal, but to be fully healed is to find the eternal within the temporal. Our pain is the persistent reminder that we are designed for the non-temporal, for the stability that only God can provide. If the metaphysical dimension of pain is about privation, and the psychological dimension is about the strain of the soul, the ethical dimension is defined by the disordered love. This is perhaps Augustine's most enduring contribution to moral philosophy. Augustine's ethics are centered entirely on love. All human action is driven by love. We are inherently desiring creatures. The quality of our life and the measure of our suffering depends entirely on the order of love that governs our desires. To love God is to love the unchangeable good, the source of all being and truth. To love the world is to love changeable, lesser goods, money, fame, comfort, other people. These are not evil in themselves, for all creation is good. Disordered love is the act of valuing a lesser good, a created thing, as if it were the supreme good, or loving a good thing to an excessive idolatrous degree. This is the root of all moral suffering and spiritual pain. We return to Augustine's lament over his friend's death, now viewed through the lens of disordered love. He recognizes that he lived in misery, like every man whose soul is tethered by the love of things that cannot last and then is agonized to lose them. The pain of loss is not a random misfortune. It is the just consequence of having misplaced ultimate trust and affection in a mutable object. If you build your house upon the sand of temporary things, the structure of your soul will collapse when the tide inevitably turns. The pain is a self-inflicted wound. The soul makes itself a prey to itself by clinging to things that are by nature fleeting. This is the tragic beauty of Augustine's insight. The pain is the mechanism by which the soul is forced to recognize its error. The hierarchy of goods is crucial here. Sin is not the creation of evil, but the turning away from the higher, unchangeable good toward the lower, changeable good. It is a preference for the gift over the giver. Consider the famous, seemingly minor sin of the pear theft from his youth. The pears were not particularly desired. They were inferior to what he had at home. The sin was not in the fruit itself, but in the love of malice, the love of doing what was forbidden for the sheer perverse pleasure of it, and the companionship of sin. This act was a perverse imitation of God's omnipotence, the desire to exercise freedom purely for self-assertion, rather than for alignment with the good. The true pain of that sin was the separation and isolation from God and from the true self, which Augustine felt long before he could intellectually articulate it. The pain of sin is not merely the punishment that follows. It is the state of being separated from the very source of one's being and happiness. It is the spiritual equivalent of being in exile, constantly longing for a home one cannot find. Augustine even explores the paradox of pleasure and pain when he asks why we desire to be made sad by beholding tragic things in theater or literature. Why do we pay money to feel sorrow? He concludes that this desire points to the complex relationship between suffering and the soul's deep desire for profound feeling. We want to feel the sorrow without experiencing the consequences of our own disordered love. We want the thrill of emotion, but we seek to keep our own spiritual attachments safe. Yet even this superficial desire for simulated suffering reveals the deep-seated illness of the soul, the thirst for an infinite object that finite things, even finite emotions, cannot satisfy. The pain we feel is a symptom that reveals the severity of the spiritual disease, the disordering of our loves. The intellectual understanding of evil as privation and the psychological recognition of the strain of the soul were powerful steps for Augustine, but they were not enough. He reached a point in his journey where the intellectual conversion was complete. Yet the moral conversion remained stubbornly out of reach. He discovered the writings of the Platonists and realized that God was a spiritual, immutable being, and that evil was indeed a privation. He knew what was true. He had the philosophical map to salvation. But this knowledge did not translate into action. He remained bound by his old habits, his lingering desires, and his inability to commit fully to the chaste life of Christian service. The intellectual conviction did not translate into moral power. This brings us to the crisis of the will, documented so agonizingly in Book 8. The will became a battleground, a place of fierce conflict between the inmost self that desired God and the lower self that clung to the comforts of the flesh. He describes himself as being held fast, not by any external constraint, but by the chains of his own making. He wanted to be a Christian. He wanted continence. But his habitual desire for the old life held him fast. The famous struggle is the internal debate, the mind commanding the body to move and the body obeying, but the mind commanding the will to change and the will resisting itself. This paralysis is the core of moral suffering. The will is constrained by its own past choices, which Augustine describes as an iron chain of habit. Every time we choose a lesser good, we reinforce the habit, making the next choice for the higher good exponentially harder. This is the terrifying paradox of freedom. Free will is the source of our ability to sin, but sin itself diminishes the will's capacity to choose the good. We freely choose slavery, and that slavery manifests as excruciating internal pain, the knowledge of what is right coupled with the inability to do it. Augustine realized that he was fighting a battle he could not win through sheer effort. He had the desire to change, but lacked the capacity to execute that change. The intellectual problem of evil was solved, but the existential problem of the weak will remained insurmountable. The moral conversion, therefore, could not be achieved through sheer effort, self-help, or philosophical insight alone. It required a radical divine intervention, the necessity of divine grace. Grace is the spiritual power that heals the will, mending the fragmentation and breaking the iron chain of habit. It is the unmerited gift of God that makes possible what is impossible for human effort. This understanding culminated in the famous scene in the garden. Overwhelmed by his internal conflict, Augustine wept under a fig tree, praying for deliverance. It was here that he heard the voice, perhaps a child's, telling him to take up and read. He opened the scriptures randomly to the passage in Romans. Not in reveling and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. The moment he finished reading, the chains snapped. The divided will became unified. The intellectual assent he had held for years finally translated into moral action because grace had intervened to heal his capacity to choose. Augustine's subsequent theological work cemented his status as the doctor of grace. He understood that salvation is entirely a gift from God, not a reward for merit. This grace is necessary to heal the will and redirect the order of love back toward its proper object. The journey from give me chastity and continence, but not yet, the ultimate expression of a divided will, to the complete surrender of the will is the trajectory of the spiritual life. The pain of the divided will is the soul's loudest cry for the grace that alone can unify it. We arrive then at the synthesis, the true meaning of pain in the Augustinian scheme. Pain is not merely a punishment, though it is often a consequence of sin. It is, more profoundly, a pedagogical tool, a divine medicine. Theological interpretation holds that God uses suffering not for its own sake, but as a means of correction and healing. Augustine teaches that tribulation is the divine medicine. It is bitter, but necessary for health. The primary purpose of this medicine is to detach the soul from its disordered attachments to the passing world. When we suffer the loss of wealth, reputation, or loved ones, the pain serves to remind us that we sought ultimate comfort in contingent things. The pain of loss compels the restless heart to seek the unchangeable rest. It is a severe yet ultimately merciful mechanism designed by God to redirect our love from the mutable creation back to the immutable Creator. Furthermore, temporal punishments, including pain, serve a redemptive purpose. They help to make reparation for past faults and sins, aligning our present suffering with the justice required by our past disobedience. By enduring suffering with patience and faith, the good may also exercise and perfect virtue. Suffering tests the sincerity of our love and refines the soul, stripping away the dross of self-reliance and pride. The pain of the present life is a constant reminder that we are still on a journey, still pilgrims, not yet at rest in the eternal city of God. It prevents us from becoming too comfortable in our exile, keeping our eyes fixed on the final destination. The ultimate model for bearing suffering is, of course, Christ himself, who endured our death and slew it by the abundance of his life. For the Christian, suffering is never meaningless. It is participation in the passion of Christ. Those who belong to Christ are, in a spiritual sense, fastened with him to the cross. The pain that we experience when united with his becomes redemptive and sanctifying. It is transformed from a meaningless burden into a source of merit and spiritual growth. The Christian response to suffering is not escape, but fortitude and love. Augustine suggests that whoever loves does all things without suffering, or if suffering, loves his suffering. This is not masochism. It is the recognition that the suffering is the instrument of God's love, perfecting the soul. Augustine concludes his own confession by recognizing that his silent inner suffering, his years of intellectual struggle and moral paralysis, was actually a loud voice calling to your mercy. The act of confession, of acknowledging one's misery, one's weakness, and one's inability to save oneself, is the first and most crucial step toward healing. It is the surrender of the proud, self-sufficient will. The true meaning of pain is that it is a mercy signal, a divinely implanted alarm system that points the soul back to its source. It is the mechanism God uses to ensure that the heart, though restless, will eventually find the only place where it can truly rest. Our journey through Augustine's Confessions reveals a profound, interconnected system of suffering. Our pain is the strain of the soul caused by disordered love, which is fundamentally a privation of good, and it is overcome only by the unifying grace of God. The pain we feel, the restlessness that drives us, is the sound of our heart knocking on the door of eternity. It is the imprint of God upon the soul, a profound emptiness that only the infinite can fill. The ultimate goal of the spiritual life, the end of all our toil and tribulation, is to be united with God. Augustine envisions this union as the cessation of all sorrow. He prays, When I come to be united to thee with all my being, then there will be no more pain and toil for me, and my life shall be a real life, being wholly filled by thee. The end of suffering is the beginning of true, unified, eternal life. The practical wisdom Augustine offers the modern seeker is this: the pain you feel means your soul is still alive and still searching for its true object. Do not medicate the pain away with temporary pleasures. Read it as a map. The greatest freedom is found not in self-mastery, which Augustine found impossible, but in the surrender of the will to the grace that heals the inner division. Trust the divine medicine, even when it tastes bitter. The path to true rest is not the avoidance of suffering, but the reordering of your entire life around the unchangeable, ever-present good. When your love is rightly ordered, even your inevitable suffering will serve the purpose of your eternal joy. If you feel this restlessness, if the strain of your soul is palpable, there is no better guide to understanding your own inner life than the text we have explored today. The Confessions of St. Augustine is the foundational spiritual autobiography that charts the personal journey from paganism and intellectual error to the stability of Christian faith. It is a profound exploration of sin, memory, desire, and the overwhelming power of grace. Reading it is not just reading history, it is reading a map of your own heart. It helps you understand the nature of your disordered loves and why your pursuit of worldly things always leaves you empty. We highly recommend diving into this text yourself to deepen your understanding of the concepts of privation, the strain of the soul, and the necessity of grace. It is a book that demands reflection and rewards it richly, and for those who prefer a more comfortable reading experience, this book is available in a large print edition, which might be helpful for easier reading as you absorb these deep philosophical insights. The link to this essential spiritual resource is available in the description below. If these words speak to you, you're not here by chance. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. Each simple action helps this message reach more hearts and reminds me that this work still has meaning.